Hey everyone, it's Jamie here. Today I want to talk about a new add-on program that I wrote for the Goes tool stack called GoesBetween. So let's imagine you have a Goes tool stack running like I do. I have Goes tools running as system services here on my Jamie Sat computer. So if I do systemctl status goesrecv, I can see that I am using goesrecv. It's actively running. It's actively receiving samples, that sort of thing. So this is currently receiving imagery. And I, for one, like to keep my ground station running as much as possible. I don't like having downtime because then I lose images. And if I'm making videos or animations based off of it, then I have skips in those videos. So I like to keep this running. I don't like to interrupt it. But what if I wanted to view the spectrum in something like SDR++? Or what if I wanted to do parallel decoding in SatDump as well as Goes tools? Well, out of the box, there's not a way to do that. GoesRecv kind of claims your software-defined radio, and you can't use it for anything else. So that's where GoesBetween comes into play. So GoesBetween will receive samples from GoesRecv and then translates them to an RTL TCP protocol so that any SDR client that supports RTL TCP, like SDR Sharp, SDR++, SatDump, and plenty of others, they can actually connect to GoesBetween, and you can use it to view the spectrum of your Goes satellite setup without having to shut down GoesRecv. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So to get started, the first thing you need to do is make sure GoesRecv is properly configured. So I'm going to open up my GoesRecv configuration here. And for the most part, you should be able to keep it the way you currently have it. But there is one change you'll likely need to make, and that's that you need to add this RTL SDR.samplePublisher section. By default, this is not in the config files. It's not even documented as far as I'm aware. But what this does is it exposes a proprietary kind of sample publisher for your RTL SDR. So what I have configured here is the sample publisher running on port 5000. And I've specified this buffer size here. You can experiment around with different numbers, but this one seems to work pretty well. One thing I want to note is do not confuse this with the clock recovery sample publisher. You cannot use the clock recovery sample publisher with GoesBetween or any other SDR program. You need to use the RTL SDR sample publisher. So I'm going to take note here in a notepad file that I have that the RTL SDR sample publisher port is on port 5000. The other thing I need to take note of is what is the sample rate of the RTL SDR. For the vast majority of us, that's going to be 2.4 million samples per second. So I'm just going to take note of that here. The other thing I need to know is the IP address of my ground station. So if I do IP-4 address, then we'll see here that the IP of my ground station is 10.0.0.2. So I'm going to take note of those things. And I don't need to save that. So I'm going to minimize out of this. And I'm going to pop over here to a command line window where I have GoesBetween. So if I pull up the help for GoesBetween, we'll see it takes a number of command line arguments. You can turn on debugging. You can display this help message. And then you can specify the host that GoesRecv is running on. You can also specify which port the GoesRecv sample publisher is on. And you can also specify which output RTL TCP port we'll be using. So there are default values for these. So if your values match the default, you don't have to specify them. So in this case, I'm going to be running GoesBetween -H. And here I'm going to put the IP address of my Goes tool stack, which was 10.0.0.2. Looking at the other options, the default GoesRecv sample publisher port of 5000 matches what is configured on my ground station, so I don't have to touch that. And we'll get to sample rate later. So the only thing I really need to specify is this. So when I hit enter, it will say waiting for RTL TCP client. So I am now ready to connect an RTL TCP client to this. So I'm going to start by using SDR++ to monitor the spectrum. So here, we need to make sure it's set to RTL TCP. The IP address is not going to be the IP address of your ground station, but it's just your local loopback 127.0.0.1 address. Because I'm running GoesBetween on the computer, I'm running SDR++ on. You can also run GoesBetween on your ground station. I'll demonstrate that later. Here, I'm keeping an RTL TCP port of 1234. That is the default for RTL TCP, and you'll also see that's the default for RTL TCP in GoesBetween. And I also need to specify the sample rate. I noted a sample rate in my text document here of 2.4 million samples per second, and that's the same thing we have here. So as soon as I click on Start, I can now see the spectrum of the GOES16 satellite. My dish is pointing at GOES16. We can even see the little telemetry signal over here to the left. If we take a look at GoesBetween, you'll see that it got an RTL TCP client, and then it connected to goesrecv, and then started bridging the samples between the two. So what you are viewing right now is the live spectrum at the time of recording of GOES16. And the neat thing about this is if I go in here and I take a look at the status of goesrecv, you'll see that goesrecv is still running. So goesrecv is running, goesproc is running. I didn't have to shut any of this down. And yet I can still use my single dish and my single SDR to view the signal. So this is one way to use it. I'm going to cancel this here. The other thing that you can do with it is you can pipe these samples straight into SatDump. So for those that are unaware, SatDump is another signal decoding program that can decode the GOES satellites. Maybe I'm somebody who's thinking about switching to SatDump, but I'm not ready to give up goesrecv yet and GoesTools. GoesBetween will let me bridge the samples over to SatDump while it's still running and actually decode the images with SatDump as well. So to do this, I still have GoesBetween running. We can see that my other client disconnected. Now it's waiting for a new one. So I'm going to, SatDump will be that new one. So I'm going to go to the recorder page. I'm going to select RTL TCP as my device type. Frequency should be 1694.1. Sample rate, again, is 2.4 megahertz. And again, I'm running GoesBetween on my computer, so I'm using the local loopback address. So once I click Start here, we can again see that nice GOES16 signal. There is a DC spike in the middle. I haven't found that actually affects much. So here we have our GOES16 signal and that telemetry signal again. And if I turn on GoesRecv decoding and I click Start, down here at the bottom, we get a nice BPSK constellation diagram. We can see that our Viterbi and our deframer are all synchronized. We're not getting too many drops here on the Reed-Solomon. And if we wait just a moment, we will probably see an image start downloading over here on the right. So not only is goesrecv, yep, right there is the image, starting to get channel 7 here from GOES16. So not only am I decoding this live with GoesTools, but I'm also decoding it using SatDump. So there are a lot of different uses that I could see for this script. One is to simply monitor your spectrum, make sure that there's not any interference or QRM causing issues with your satellite reception. The other is to do parallel decoding with SatDump and GoesTools, so you can get two different opinions, if you will, on what the data says. Or if you want to transition from GoesTools to SatDump, then this will enable you to make that transition without actually losing any imagery. So before I end this video, I do want to do one more demonstration. So right now, I am running GoesBetween on the same computer that's running SatDump. And the GoesTools stack is over on another computer sitting out in my shed. But I can run this the other way around. You don't have to run GoesBetween on a computer with your SDR program. You can also run it on another side. So I'm going to stop this here, and I'm going to switch over. I'm also going to cancel out of GoesBetween here. And on my ground station, we see I have GoesBetween compiled for Linux. And again, there's our help file. Now, this time around, I don't need to specify the IP address, because by default, it uses a local loopback for the goesrecv IPv4 address. So since this is on the same computer as goesrecv, I can just run GoesBetween. And we see now we're waiting for an RTL TCP client. So now everything else is going to be the same, except on my RTL TCP program, I now need to be specifying the correct address for GoesBetween is running. But once I click Start, we can see that right away I can see the signal again. And if I click on Start here, I can again decode the signal. So it's a pretty versatile program. You can run GoesBetween with your stack. You can run it where you're running your SDR program. In theory, you can actually run it on a third computer. You can have GoesTools on one computer, and then GoesBetween on a second computer, and then something like SatDump or SDR++ on a third computer. I don't really recommend doing that. It's a lot of bandwidth to push SDR samples across a network like this. So I find it's best to use one or two computers. It seems to work fine across two computers. Something else I've noticed is if you're using GoesBetween over a wireless network, so if you have your ground station out in a shed or in a waterproof box out in your yard somewhere and it's connected back via Wi-Fi, you might have a hard time getting GoesBetween to run smoothly. If you're just monitoring the spectrum in something like SDR++, that's fine. You might notice some herky-jerkiness in the movement, but you'll still be able to see the signal. But if you're trying to use GoesBetween to pump data between GoesTools and SatDump over Wi-Fi, you might have a bad time because SatDump is expecting regular samples from the software-defined radio. And with the latency that can be added by a weak Wi-Fi connection, the deframer down here will lose sync pretty regularly. So it will work, but it won't work very well. So I do recommend using a wired connection or a very strong Wi-Fi connection. So the download for GoesBetween is over on my GitHub. I'll put a link for that down in the description. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me or leave a question in the comments, and I'll get back to you when I can. So thanks for watching, and have a great day. Bye.